And then I'm going to attempt to do something that it normally isn't done, and that's next Sunday night, there's a guest speaker, if I recall correctly. All right, unless Doug was messing with me now. So there were 2 more units to cover. Tonight we're going to talk about the crucifixion and the resurrection in John chapter 19 and John chapter 20. Hopefully we get through them both, but it's, we'll be in John 19 verses 17 through 30, and then we'll be in the first 18 verses of John 20 for the resurrection. Hopefully we get through it all, but if we don't, well, then I'll give you some reading assignments to complete that. So we'll just go ahead and get started with. We'll talk about the crucifixion. So in John 19, starting in verses 17 through 30. I'll just read. I'll just hit verses 17 through 22, and then we can kind of talk amongst ourselves. And I'll read from the New King James. If you're reading from the ESV, I know there's some differences, or whatever version, your New American Standard, NIV, whatever. But I'll stick with what the book used, and that's New King James, just for the core stuff. And he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him and 2 others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the center. Now Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Then many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Therefore the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but he said, I am the King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." So passage we're all, or at least that concept we're all familiar with, because it's covered in the other Gospels as well. Golgotha, Luke is the only Gospel writer in the King James and the New King James. There may be another version or two where you'll see it translated Calvary, right? For whatever reason, translators decided they wanted to use the Latin term for skull instead of Golgotha, which is the Hebrew or Aramaic. And another thing about these passages is depending on what version you have, sometimes they'll say, "Oh, well, he said or she said in Hebrew, he said or she said in Aramaic," right? They were speaking Aramaic, but Aramaic and Hebrew are so close, it's a lot like Italian and Spanish. Right? They're very, very similar. You can understand each other almost entirely. So, just I guess something to bear in mind. When you get to verse 20, right? Verse 19, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. You get to verse 20, and the sign's written in Hebrew. Your translation might say Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. It's going to be pretty much the same alphabet. So Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, as the New King James says. Why in 3 languages? What do you think? Anybody coming in the city can read it? Because you got Greek, right? Greek was kind of the common language, courtesy of Alexander the Great, several hundred years before. So Greek was spread across. In fact, that's what the New Testament was written in. In fact, and even when you read through the New Testament and you see them quoting the Old Testament, a lot of times, if you go to the Old Testament, it may not match up word for word. There might be some differences. Well, if you really want to nerd out in the Bible stuff, right? There's the Septuagint, which is basically the Greek Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that was done. Ptolemy II in Egypt did that. That happened around 270, 280 BC. So a couple hundred years before Christ was on the earth, people had access to, if you had the right connections, right, had access to the Old Testament in Greek. So Greek was becoming a pretty common language. Latin would be the Romans, right? Latin would come to dominate in the years following, to a point where, at least in Europe, for a number of years, if you wanted to read the Bible, you better learn to read Latin, right? And you better learn to speak and read Latin. And then, of course, you got Hebrew/Aramaic, right? New King James says Hebrew. I don't know if anyone else has a translation that says it was written in Aramaic, but nevertheless, right? 3 languages cover all barriers. So anyone that can read comes in and sees the sign. But you get to verse 21, and Therefore the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but he said, 'I'm the King of the Jews.'" The ESV will say, "This man said, 'I'm the King of the Jews.'" And the NIV, I think, says, "This man claimed to be the King of the Jews." Why? Why are they being so nitpicky, do you think?
Because Pilate, who is authority there,
Right.
is saying he is the King of the Jews.
Right.
The priests are saying he's claiming.
Exactly, right? Yeah, because there is a difference. You know, on the one hand, you say this man's King of the Jews, but the chief priests are like, no, he's not the King of the Jews. He's just saying he's the King of the Jews. And if you'll make that change, Pilate, we would be really happy as the overseers of Judaism, right? And what Pilate says in verse 22, "What I have written, I have written." Now, John's the only one that includes this. And John's the only one that includes, if you go back in John 18, verse 38, Pilate asked Jesus this question that has been one of the mysteries for ages. I've yet to find anyone that can tell you definitively what exactly this means. But you remember when Pilate said to Jesus, "What is truth?" That statement, that's only in John, right? And this, "What I've written, is only in John too. John has this, the Gospel of John, as we've been studying over the past quarter with Doug, it's very interesting and it's very unique from the other three. And Pilate answers and makes a statement, "What I have written, I have written." And we don't know the context of that, right? Do you think it was more like Pilate just saying, "I'm in charge. I say, this is what he said."
Could also be he's insulting them.
Oh, good point. Yeah, it could also be that Pilate is insulting them, like putting them in their place, right? Like, you're not in charge, I'm in charge, right?
Politics said that Pilate was doing what he was doing. Pilate was trying to keep it quiet there so that the emperor wouldn't get on his case.
Yeah.
So he was doing this against his own will, and the Jews were forcing him to do it.
Right. Yeah. So Pilate's trying to stay in the emperor's good graces and not lose his head or not end up out in the street. So he's doing what he has to do because that's just the line he has to take. Right. From a political perspective, that good point.
I'll say it is he's just showing his leadership over the Jews.
Okay, showing his leadership. Yeah. Yep, showing his leadership over the Jews. And I'm repeating, just so the audio recording picks it up, since we don't run around like crazy people with microphones anymore. And not that any of us miss those days, right, where you're shoving a microphone in someone's face. But yes, so showing his authority over them. I mean, we know that there's been problems with the Jews, right? The Jews and the Romans, they're not too thrilled with the Romans. We know that there's going to be big problems. In fact, it was, about 100 years prior, in about 71 BC, that over in Italy you had Spartacus with his revolt, right? And went from 73 to 71 BC. The Romans put that down, and an interesting thing happens, during that, is that the Roman general Crassus literally crucified 6,000 people on the Appian Way back to Rome, from a spot just north of where Naples is, up the Appian Way to Rome, right? Kind of as an example, hey, don't ever do this again, right? And which I guess from a cruelty standpoint, right? We know that Jesus is being crucified. That was an absolutely horrible, awful way to die, right? Where you basically asphyxiate to death at some point, right? Because we'll see when we get into actually, I don't think we cover those verses, but where the Roman soldiers go to break the legs, right? They want to get them down before they hit, Sabbath. They want to get that out of the way. So they'll break their legs, and then they can't kind of sustain their breathing. Then they just kind of end up suffocating to death. Crucifixion was horrible to the standpoint that even contemporary writers that weren't necessarily affected by that, right? That weren't being persecuted. Cicero and others talk about just the inhumanity, the cruelty of crucifixion. That it was shameful Right? This was reserved for very extreme slave revolts. So what happened to Spartacus, or happened to 6,000 of the slaves that were caught and defeated by the Roman army, them getting crucified, and just in general, how just horrible and cruel it was. I think the only thing probably worse than that was getting torn apart by animals in something like a Colosseum, but that wasn't something that was happening every day, right? That wasn't a 24/7 thing. So crucifixion was absolutely horrendous thing to do, and so, you know. But again, yeah, what I have written when Pilate says that, and in verse 22, yeah, we don't know what it really means, but it was probably a matter of, you know, Pilate establishing his dominance, or doing what he had to do for any number of reasons, right? Certainly politics come into play with that as well, just kind of keeping that house in order. I mean, we know it's not going to last, right? Because we know that we're like 40 years away from Jerusalem being assaulted and demolished by the Roman general Titus. And then, of course, we know Masada. For those of you who've ever been to Israel, you probably visited Masada, that big fortress where the Jews kind of holed up and then ended up committing suicide as the Romans built that big dirt ramp that they had learned from probably the Greeks, probably Alexander the Great. He did that, land bridges and dirt ramps and things like that. So in any event, all right. Moving on to verses 23 and 24, let's talk about the soldiers. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top in one piece. Therefore they said therefore among themselves, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose shall it be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Therefore the soldiers did these things. Right, so that's John quoting from Psalm, the 22nd chapter, verse 18. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. David would have written that, the ballpark, about 1,000 years before this happened. That's a pretty amazing thing, granted divinely inspired and all that, but to write something 1,000 years ahead of time, and for it to happen, and as commentators had pointed out that, you know, God's ultimate plan was going to be accomplished. And it didn't always involve using godly people to accomplish it. Sometimes these ungodly people are doing things that accomplish what God needed to be done. So in this case, the Roman soldiers, right? We don't use the word tunic that much. I don't. Is anyone I kind of know what it is, but is anyone familiar with the word tunic? Maybe you use it on a regular basis throughout your household? No? When I was in the military, and I was wearing, I'll just call them camouflage clothes. The technical term was BDUs, battle dress uniform, I think. But I had an undershirt, which is usually brown, or black. In the Air Force, we could use different colors. You know, we were freer. And then the top portion, the camouflage thingy, people would call that a tunic from time to time. So I think of tunic as like the outer robe, right? This is a vest, but if it was flowing, it could be possibly a tunic. I don't know. Any tunic?
King James says coat.
What's that?
King James says coat.
Okay, coat. Perfect. But you think it's going to be, it's probably not like a North Face jacket where it was, you know, it's a long piece, right? It says it was, because it without seam, woven from the top in one piece. So they didn't want to tear that up, right? So they're going to cast lots to see, hey, who gets that, right? Because when you're being crucified, your stuff's gone, right? Not that people had stuff in the way that we have stuff today, right? But clothes were, I can imagine, clothes were not something that are, you know, there was no Abercrombie and Fitch or Walmart or whatever to walk into and buy latest and greatest, right? So it was probably pretty valuable. Pretty valuable. To the point where even Jesus said, you remember when he said, hey, if someone wants to give me your cloak as well, right? So, all right, yeah, kind of basic there. But again, John, so I'll go ahead and jump ahead of what I was going to say. This is the first time the first time within this section here where John's talking about prophecy being fulfilled. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke won't tell you that. Now, they'll tell you that in other parts of the gospel. But when it comes to the crucifixion, John is very, very, he has these very unique things, right? The statements from Pilate, right? What is truth? And what I've written. And this notion of the casting lots for the clothes, divided up my garments. John points out, hey, this is so prophecy should be fulfilled. He could just quote the verse and we kind of figure that out, but he actually says, hey, this is so, and he's going to do it again. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't do that. Now, does that mean they're lesser gospels? No. It just means that because when we get to the resurrection, John leaves things out that Matthew, Mark, and Luke will talk about. Like John just says literally Mary Magdalene shows up. Well, no, the other three gospel writers tell us there are more, but for whatever reason, John wants you to focus on Mary Magdalene. Why he did that? I mean, that's what God wanted him to write, right? It's just one of those interesting things, as we all know with the four gospels, that it's interesting. You got to kind of harmonize them, right? That's why there's whole books on harmony of the four gospels, of seeing, oh, this happened here, this only happened here. It's just interesting, I guess, facts about it. All right, so we move on from the soldiers, and now we move to the witnesses. Who was there to see Jesus being crucified, right? Verses 25 through 27, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, and we know who the disciple whom he loved is, right? That's John. And John calls himself that. None of the other gospel writers call him that, but there's a number of theories why John calls himself that. But it's definitely not like Jesus loves me more than anyone type of thing. I can't imagine that at all. But the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home. Verse 25, right, we go back to the people that were there, and there's different theories around how many women are actually present in verse 25. Some say, oh, it's two, because the grammar is slightly uncertain, this, that, and the other. And some people say, oh, it's three, and a lot of folks settle on four. And I tend to take it at four. When you read the other gospel writers and talk about who was there and who was there at the resurrection, it kind of makes more sense that Jesus' mother, Mary, right? His mother's sister, name unknown. I think it's Mark that mentions Salome. So is Salome Mary's mother's, or Jesus' mother, is Salome Mary's sister? We don't know. But according to John, Jesus' mother, his mother's sister, so his aunt, Mary, the wife of Clopas. We don't know who Clopas is. There's a similar name in the New Testament that it may be, maybe the same person, and Mary Magdalene. So you got, out of that four, three of them are Marys, right? That's a lot of Marys, right? I wanted to name my daughter Maria when she was born, and we chose not to because my mother-in-law's named Maria, and everybody else in South Florida, where my mother-in-law comes out of, they're all named Maria, right? So, that's okay. In this case, you got a lot of Marys. There are a lot of Marys. Three out of the four named group of women, three of them were named Mary, right? Just a common name, I guess. But notice that the men that are named, the disciples, it's what? It's one. It's just John. That John actually names, he's the only one, the disciple whom he loved standing by. And so in verse 26, when Jesus says, "Woman, behold your son," at first, does it seem like Jesus is talking to Mary, his mother, and saying, "Hey, behold your son"? Is that the impression that we might get? That's the impression that I get on the first read of that. But then in verse 27, he says to the disciple, "Behold your mother." So in verse 27, Jesus is talking to John. He's the only male disciple there, and he's saying, "Behold your mother." And in verse 27 says, "And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home." Well, guess what? That's not his mama. That's not his mother. And we know that Jesus had brothers. Mark chapter 6, verse 3, Matthew chapter 13, 54 and 56. We know that Jesus had 4 brothers. We know he had at least 2 sisters as well, because that passage in Matthew 13 talks about, his sisters, he uses the plural, but they're not named. But where was Jesus' siblings at? John chapter 7 verse 5 tells us, this is pretty early on, that Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. They didn't believe who he was. We know that's going to change, because when we get into Acts, we'll see that his siblings are there in one accord and praying and waiting and things like that. But none of Jesus' family is there except for his mother and his aunt. And so when he's looking down at John and his mother, most commentators, and I'm starting to think this is probably where it's at based on how verse 27 ends, that Jesus is saying, he's looking at his mother, and then he's kind of, he wouldn't exactly be able to point, but maybe a nod or something like that, like, this is now your son. And you, John, that's now your mother. Take care of her. I mean, we don't know what happened to, there's a lot we don't know, right? We don't know what happened to Joseph, right? Mary's husband. We don't know, but we can assume at this point that maybe he passed away, right? And none of Jesus' siblings are around, and you can go further back and see passages where people are asking Jesus about his family, and he's pointing to his disciples and saying, this is my family. So does it make sense for Jesus to make sure that his earthly mother is taken care of when he's gone, right? Going to be back, but ultimately he's going to be gone, right? Back to heaven. Does that make sense? Am I off base here in terms of thinking that John, or Jesus is saying to John, or Jesus is saying to his mother, behold your son?
I think the spiritual aspect of it, though, is that he knows that John is a follower.
Okay.
And that for things that are to come, his mother will be with people who still believe.
Yeah, so Jesus knows that John is a follower, and that his mother would be with someone who believes in the event that his siblings who aren't there, but most likely they would be around, and when Mary, mother of Jesus, right? Not the other 2 Marys, would come back around, they'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, mom will take care of you. But the spiritual aspect, right? So I guess good point, because think of this in terms of, let's say someone had children, and this may actually, I'm sure it's happened, but let's say the siblings you had or the parents you had or whatever, and you were a Bible-believing Christian, and you wanted your kids to be raised to know the Word of God, but all the family that you have are not going to do that at all. And you had people that you were very close with. You think it's possible that there are people that would write into a will in the event of this, that, or the other? These people, I mean, that's the whole notion of the whole godfather, godmother concept, right? In other cultures, where if something happens, you take responsibility for that child. Maybe you're not raising them 24/7, but you take responsibility to make sure that child has what they need as they get older into adulthood. So to your point, Melanie, yeah, that's a very good point. Maybe Jesus is like, well, here's John. Now there's some people think that John is the only disciple who doesn't get martyred. Right? Because John, we know that John goes on in years and he ends up on Patmos, right? It's where we get Revelation. We know that John sticks around a while. Now, when you start getting into what happened to all the disciples, there's a lot of urban legends of, oh, here's what happened to Peter and here's what happened to Andrew, and a lot of it's just unknown. It's just not written. There's some other sources that you can kind of look at, but as far as like the Bible, right, it doesn't necessarily tell us what happened to everyone. So there's some people that believe that Jesus would have done that to John because, yes, he was a committed follower, but also because he wasn't going to get martyred like some of the others are. Because we know that some of them do. We do see that in the New Testament. But it's a very interesting exchange. And I guess you have God in the flesh being crucified, and yet he still has concern for his earthly mother. I mean, we expect nothing less from Jesus, right? We know the intense love he has for us that we could never match that love, but it's just a very interesting exchange there. Yeah.
I'll give you a flip side of
Sure.
something else to think about there.
Please.
I think he could have been protecting John because he knew John's plans, because nobody could have believed and known who Jesus actually was any better than Mary, because how he was conceived.
So just so.
Together to keep his faith straight.
Okay, so Richie's saying that Jesus could have done that to keep John close to Mary, because Mary truly knew probably more than a lot of people who Jesus was, and that keeping them together, she would be taken care of, and John would be strengthened in his faith, right? That's a good point. We all know that especially those of y'all that are in teachers, y'all know this 1,000 times more than someone like me who lives in corporate America. Like the company you keep, all you teachers in here have probably seen a good student go bad or a bad student go good based on who they were hanging around with, right? I mean, I'm sure all y'all run your classrooms like a drill sergeant, but I mean those other teachers, right? Am I wrong? Have you seen that? Have y'all seen that? Or yeah. Because we're very impressionable at a young age. We're very impressionable now. I mean, we're all, whatever. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, verses 28 through 30. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, here's John again, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. Now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there, and they filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, and put it to his mouth. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. So verse 29, John is quoting Psalm chapter 69, verse 21. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink. And again, John makes it a point to tell us this was done to fulfill Scripture. Same thing he did back in verse 24. Again, I mentioned again that John is the only gospel writer who does something like this with respect to like the crucifixion type account. But remember, if you think way back to the start of the quarter, the purpose of the Gospel of John, right? That's to show that Jesus was the true Messiah. In fact, if we're not getting this far into John, but if we go to John chapter 20, verse 31, it says, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name, right? So that's the goal of the book of John here, is to make sure that you know that Jesus is the Christ, the true Messiah, and not anyone else, right? So that's why he's telling you, hey, this is to fulfill prophecy here. But it's not done, right? Fulfilling prophecy is not done, even though John, mentions those two. Verse 30, so when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished, and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. He died when prophecy was fulfilled, right? Everything that needed to be done was done. And so at that point, Jesus makes that one final request, I thirst, to fulfill another prophecy, right? So in case there's any doubt, people might look back and say, oh, well, one prophecy was fulfilled or whatever, but it's just prophecy after prophecy after prophecy spread across different books, different authors. If you got David writing in Psalms, 1,000 years ago, when you get into other prophecies like Zechariah, you can even go back to like Exodus and Numbers for some of them. We can go back to early Genesis, right? When God is pronouncing punishment on Adam and Eve and the serpent or the devil, right? In terms of what you should bruise his heel and bruise your head, right? I mean, you can read into that if you want. So, but John is making it a point to let us know that prophecy is being fulfilled. And why is John making us aware of that? Because again, the purpose of John's gospel is for us to believe, and if prophecies are fulfilled, that's a lot easier for us to believe, right? And if we were to keep reading chapter 19, oh, actually, let me back up here. I think I jumped ahead of this earlier when I mentioned that. Well, there was another one in terms of Jesus' legs being broken and his side being pierced that we don't go through, and then you get into the whole blood and water pour out and all the different theories that people have about what that actually means, what it's referring to, and this, that, and the other. But yeah, basically Jesus knew at that point it's time, and you notice that because they didn't have to break Jesus' legs because he was already dead. Right. Bowing his head, he gave up his spirit in verse 30. Sounds like he gave it up, right? He's like, everything's been done. It's my time, and I'm gone, right? I guess there's. I haven't personally experienced this with anyone close to me, but. And I don't know if how they portrayed on TV is right, but this notion of people get to a point to where if they don't wish to keep on going, that they can just close their eyes. That is a real thing, I assume, right? I've never seen it, but it's okay. Thank you. Medical opinion. Yes. Thank you. Very real thing. So it's a matter of will, and. In the case of Jesus, of course, Jesus being God in the flesh, there's nothing that Jesus couldn't do, but he'd been beaten and abused so bad, and just through that trial process and just the damage that's been done to his body, it may have been. I don't want to say that anyone could do that. That's not what I'm saying. Jesus was still very, very much divine, very, very much God, but he determined that. I'm closing my eyes and I'm done. And the others, the two robbers that were crucified on the other sides of them, they did have to have their legs broken because they were still heaving. So that to me is just very powerful. It's finished. He bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. He was like, I've done everything I need to do. There's no sense in delaying this. I got my mother, my aunt, other followers of mine sitting here watching me suffer, right? Most of us parents don't even like it when our kid's bleeding, even if it's a surface, right? I can't even begin to imagine what that would be like to see something like that, just how horrendous it was, So no doubt. Well, we know Jesus was thinking. We know he was thinking of him, right? Because he does an exchange with. Behold thy son, behold thy mother, like making sure that the earthly stuff, even though he's coming back in 3 days, even though he's coming back in a couple of days, it's still making sure that in the short term you're taken care of, right? So, all right, any thoughts, comments on that before we kind of move on to the resurrection? Like I said, if you kept reading John chapter 19, you'll see a couple more prophecies being fulfilled that John talks about. The piercing of his side.
Look at this story, it's just amazing. Christ chose the exact time he was going to be born, and here he chose the time he was leaving.
Yeah. So Bob says it's, Christ, the exact time he was born was chosen, and the exact time he was leaving was chosen, right? In the fullness of time, right? That encompasses all those actions in there that God sent him, right? Yeah, it is, absolutely. And it's not when we want it, it's when Christ wanted. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's go over to John chapter 20, and we'll cover verses 1 through 18. It's really two sections, the empty tomb, verses 1 through 10, and then kind of the risen Lord, verses 11 through 18. And the bell is, there it is. That clock is like 2 minutes fast. I look down at my watch and realize I hit it. So whoever's doing that, good on whoever that. Oh, is that Don Watson? Good Don Watson. I think he got up and did that. How about that? Our number one bell ringer. All right. Anyways, if you need to take the Lord's Supper, you can do it this morning. You head down that hallway. It's 105 on the left, 107. It'll be on the left. Just open a door until you see communion. All right, the empty tomb, John chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. I'll read just verses 1 and 2. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved and said to them, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So, like I mentioned before in verse 1 here, John has a different kind of account of this. He just tells you about Mary Magdalene. That's all. Other gospel writers will mention more people than that. In fact, when Mary Magdalene and others are talking about the tomb, they're going there to kind of anoint Jesus with spices that they had purchased. Right? They knew where it was. In fact, the tomb was we didn't even talk about the whole where is Golgotha, the place of the skull, and if you go to Jerusalem, there's this Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which would have been outside of the walls at the time, and then you got the Garden Tomb, which is another place with a hill that really kind of sells it more than the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with that's actually like the Orthodox regional headquarters, and so it's like a very ornate building with all sorts of, flashy, shiny stuff. And then the Garden Tomb is just like this. There's a hill, and then you can see where there's a tomb that's been cut out of the rock, and you can kind of go, and I don't know if those of you, several in here have seen, you've seen it, you remember that, yeah. Yeah, you can kind of go in, and you're like, well, is this, I don't know, but this seems a lot more kind of, it's outside the city walls, it's a hill, and that kind of could look like a skull, and this, that, and the other. It doesn't really matter. But we didn't go down that road. But in any event, if you go to Mark's account, in Mark chapter 16, verse 3, you see that they're talking with each other and saying, the ladies are saying, well, who's going to move that stone for us so that we can get in there and kind of anoint him? Because what people don't know is how big that actual stone was. But it was big enough to where it was going to require multiple people to kind of get that stone out of the way, right? One of the more, again, the whole empty tomb and the concept of, well, how could you move that stone, right? Especially from the inside where you can't really get leverage on the side. And they say that it would have been dropped into like a rut, right? So when the stone, like it would be easy to push and roll it down, but once it hit that rut, if you've ever had your car stuck in the mud, you just get deeper and deeper in that rut. It's a lot harder to get it out, right? All right, let's see here. Verse 3 and 4, Peter therefore went out and the other disciple and were going to the tomb, so they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. So Mary Magdalene goes and tells them, and Peter and John start heading that way, and then all of a sudden they just take off running, right? And John beats them there, which is kind of interesting. If you go over to John, the 21st chapter, I think verse 7, it's when Jesus is on the shore, and they decide to go fishing. Peter's like, I'm going to go fishing, and other people go in the boat with him. And they're out there, and then there's Jesus, and it's John that says, it is the Lord. And Peter, if you remember, he just like grabs his overcoat and dives in the water and swims, and the rest of them are kind of, and I always wondered, did Peter kind of like, was he thinking, well, John beat me to the tomb the first time, and now this time, now that I actually see Jesus in the flesh, he ain't beating me a second time. You got to imagine 12 guys are competitive. You put two people in a room, and but especially like those kind of blue collar guys, they're super competitive with each other. But I just think that's an interesting. It's not biblical. Like I can't say the Lord intended for this race to be. I'm just saying it's an interesting thing that these same two guys, here they are later on, and now it's the other way around. Peter's like, I ain't gonna lose. But of course, we also remember Peter was the guy, like he would just do it, jump out. Let me come out there with you, Lord. Let me walk on the water. Like Peter was gung ho. That's right. Peter was ready. Yeah, he was gung ho. He's the one that cut off Malchus's ear. He's the one that rebuked the Lord and says, you're not going to wash my feet. I mean, Peter was just, he was there.
Wasn't John the younger of the two?
the younger of the two. So, yeah, I don't know. They weren't brothers, but no, I'm thinking of James, because there's like the greater and the lesser. I don't know if John was younger than Peter. I don't know. I mean, if anybody know? No? Where were you going with that, Patrick? With?
Just that he might explain why he ran ahead of Peter. He was the younger.
Oh, okay, younger. Yeah, he was in better shape. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, that's a good point. He could have had better lung capacity, and Peter just it's a good point. Age definitely does change us, right? As we all know. I know I don't, but I can tell you when I'm the many times that I've played pickleball with your grandson Draken, and he'll lunge all over the court and make these crazy shots. We'll all collectively go, that's because that's the knees of like a 14 or a 15-year-old. Man, if I put my knee down here without a pad, so I'm guessing as I surpass my 40s that it gets to the point to where I don't even want my knees to even think about touching a floor. I'm just going to walk around with knee pads all the time. Yeah, so good point. There could have been an age difference there between Peter and John, quite possibly. Quite possibly. He was older?
It says here that he was older, considering one of the older disciples, due to the fact that he was already married, while John is often thought to be the youngest of the apostles.
Okay. Wonder what that age difference could have been, though. Never know. Never know.
It says here, Peter the oldest, 26 to 30.
So it's an estimate that Peter was 26 to 30?
Yeah.
Yeah, but marathon runners don't hit their prime till they're in their 30s. Maybe it was a short distance. Yeah. They don't. You see them on the Olympics there.
If you're inferring things, Peter and Andrew had their own fishing business with their own boat.
Right.
James and John were working for their father.
Right.
In his business, so obviously she's saying Peter's married. So
Yeah.
lots of things that make you think he's more mature or has lived more.
Yeah, I'm tired from all these kids, all that stuff. You just never know. What's that?
Maybe Peter still had his sword on. That makes it a little slow.
That's true. That's a good point. Peter could have still had his sword on. Yes, all these good. We should write a collective commentary, a Walter Hill commentary, and compete with all those other academics that learn so much that they all turn crazy, right? All right. Let's see here. Let's try and, I guess, finish. Oh, we got like 2 minutes left. Let me just hit the highlights here of... Okay, we already talked about that. So we keep moving on to the tomb, and really we just get down to verse 9, when Peter and John are seeing in the tomb, and Jesus is gone. Verse 8 actually is pretty cool, because John says, and he saw and believed, which is very straightforward from John. But verse 9, for as they yet did not know the scripture, that he must rise again from the dead. Jesus said in Luke 24, 25 through 27, 44 through 46, it talks about how Jesus has kind of taught a lot of things to the disciples in terms of scripture, right? So it just hadn't clicked yet, right, in terms of what was going on there, because there's not a direct single Old Testament passage that this is referring to, as far as the empty tomb and the resurrection. But then the disciples went away again to their own homes in verse 10. So we get down to the last verses here, 11 through 18, where you've got Mary outside the tomb weeping and saying, and she's clearly moved by the fact that Jesus isn't there. And then she sees Jesus. She thinks he's the gardener or the groundskeeper, depending on the translation. She's like, where have you taken my Lord's body? Tell me where he is. And then in verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary, and she turned to him and say, Rabboni, which is to say teacher. And let's see here. Yeah, that's kind of it. Oh, let me just read you. I know the bell just rang. Let me read you. I'll read you what Doug wrote, so I can end this on give you an Argoism here, right? Argo. Yeah, I didn't know how to say a Douglas knowledge bit. All right, here we go. Excuse me. He mentions kind of 5 things that we've talked about in the study of John. truth in the Word, faith through seeing miracles, the new birth through baptism, relationship of Christ, the vine and the branches, John, referring to John chapter 15, humility, and then he writes this here, so I have to assume this is what's coming. Foundation spring issue, because this book is a foundations from Gospel Advocate. Other writings of John. So my guess is 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. That's probably a guess. Or he's talking about John 17, which would be a direct competition with Jake. But thank y'all for attending, and next week it will be a guest speaker.